Hello, and welcome to part 3 of my ongoing series on Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. We're on the introduction part 3 of volume 1, and this is a very important section. This is the first section where he begins to outline his set of dichotomies, the most important of such, the world as history versus the world as nature. And he views the world as history as an organic world impression, an organic way of thinking about the world, and world as nature as a mechanical or mathematical way of looking at the world. So with that said, on to the first point. He begins this section by saying that his theme broadens itself to a philosophy of the future. So, fairly grandiose way to say things, but perhaps good for marketing. And then he says, so far as the metaphysically exhausted soil of the West can bear such. So, he'll develop this point more throughout the balance of these two volumes, but when he's talking about this metaphysically exhausted soil of the West, that's because the West is a culture in its state of fulfillment, in his terminology. It's a culture on the brink of becoming a civilization, which would be a dead form, which would no longer possess the vitality of the prime symbol, an artistic vitality, and a philosophical, religious vitality. And he says, perhaps this is the only philosophy within Western possibilities at this stage. So, somewhat interesting. Maybe Spengler's philosophy is the only philosophy that a Faustian soul could be capable of at this late stage. So, just something to think about. On to the second point. Now we're into world as history versus world as nature, the central dichotomy in Spengler's historiography, in his approach to the study of history. And he says, the world as nature, hitherto, has been almost the only theme of philosophy. And he's probably largely right. You have all these systematic German philosophers, and yeah, they're focused on creating some system of deductive syllogisms by and large, and this is what Plato and Aristotle did. Now, you might have some examples of some philosophers who didn't focus on things like that. Maybe David Hume to some degree, Edmund Burke, I think. So I'm not sure how true this is generally, but within the German tradition, certainly. And then he says what he's trying to do here is give a picture of life, not an ensemble picture of everything. So world as nature, this mode of thinking that he criticizes as it's applied to history. He thinks world as nature has its place in physics, chemistry, and other such fields, but that it's not applicable to history. And he thinks the world as nature is trying to give this ensemble picture of everything, trying to describe everything in the world according to these never-changing laws. And what he's just trying to do is give a picture of life, show the actuality that exists at any one time. And this is another key dichotomy. Things becoming versus things become. So he's going to say world is history. This is how you study things becoming. Because these cultures are still in a phase of evolution or a phase of development. And so they're still living. So we need to use his analogical approach because they're things becoming, whereas the things that a physicist or a chemist studies are things become. The hydrogen atoms are already there in his conception. Well, I mean, obviously they're there with or without his conception, but this differs from history in a key sense in his conception, because history is this thing becoming. Now, what about an animal? So for him, an animal or a plant, I mean, those are certainly things becoming. So I think he also does not think that you can posit any sort of universal laws for the study of biology outside of things that you gain through this analogical approach. So for any biologists out there, who knows to what extent that comports with your experience, but that would be his position. Now on to the third point. He calls this the organic versus mechanical world impression. So again, we're getting our big dichotomy between history, the organic, the living, and between nature, the mechanical, the mathematical. Now in English, it probably doesn't translate that well. And again, maybe this is a problem with Atkinson's translation. Maybe it's just the nature of translating from German to English. I don't know. But to call nature as the opposite of organic sounds absolutely nonsensical to a reasonable English speaker. Nature would be what you think of as organic. And again, organic just means carbon-based in its most rigorous definition. So all life forms on Earth are organic, and that is how we have this word, organic. So it's quite curious that he calls it history versus nature in this sense. But, well, I don't know. Maybe it's just a thing where it translates poorly into English. But again, maybe that's why you want to read philosophers in translation. It's easier for a philosopher to play word games with himself in his native language. Once it gets translated to a foreign language, the slack in the concepts, the weakness in the concepts will become much more apparent. So anyway, he views the organic versus the mechanical world impression as images versus laws, or pictures and symbols versus formulas or systems. So he wants to have imagistic, pictorial, symbolic approaches to his analogical comparison, this comparative morphology. And he wants that opposed to any rule-based, formulaic, systematic exposition that a nature thinker, a physicist or a chemist would give you. And he calls this the difference between the instantly actual, the historic, from the constantly possible, the natural. And this is to emphasize how important time is to Spengler's thinking, which we'll get into with the two next points, and even further with the final point of this video. But yes, it's just time is very important for him, so he views any of these natural processes as constantly possible, because that's what you would be able to repeat in the laboratory. You would be able to control the conditions so that you can get the same result ideally. Now you have p-hacking, you have the difficulty of replication, the replication crisis, you have all these things, but ideally it should be constantly possible to produce those results. But in thinking of that, I just think of, certainly as an engineering matter, and maybe engineering, Spengler would say, is an area where history and nature meet. I don't know. It seems like there's not much room for overlap, if any, in his kind of dichotomized framework. But you think about something like a big hydroelectric dam. Like, yes, the principles that allow you to generate electricity from hydroelectric motion, or from, hydraulic motion of a river, that's obviously natural knowledge that's always going to exist. Those are the laws of nature, with the conditions that you have at any engineering site. But at the same time, a hydroelectric dam is only going to be valuable in certain areas. Like, there's only so many areas where you're going to get, this good kinetic energy from the water, from it going from a higher altitude down to a lower altitude, presumably, or you're able to dam it up in a big way and able to kind of artificially create that. But But so it's not really constantly possible, I don't think, a lot of these times. And then if you think about the replication crisis and all this, so, maybe we've got too rigid of concepts here. And again, maybe it's just his habit of speaking in absolute terms, this kind of very German philosophical habit. So the next point between his organic and mechanical world impression is imagination ordering according to plan, that would be the organic historical approach, versus experience dissecting according to scheme. That's the natural, the natural approach, the mechanical approach that he doesn't want to apply to history. So the interesting things here are imagination versus experience. So he thinks his view, this imagination, and it's largely imagining the psychology of other people and other peoples, people from other cultures, who have obviously different ideas about the world than a Faustian man at this civilizational phase, as Spengler conceives of himself. So he's trying to put himself in their shoes according to some plan, as opposed to according to a scheme. So plan versus scheme is also an interesting dichotomy, because for me, there's no actual denotative distinction there. There's a connotative distinction. A scheme is more nefarious than a plan, usually. But if you say plan or scheme, I personally cannot draw a principled distinction between those two terms on short reflection. Maybe it is there, I don't know. And then just to round out imagination versus experience, so nature is going to use empirical observation, whereas history has to kind of use what it has, right? You can't do a controlled experiment of any historical, economic, social, or other such process. So he thinks imagination is going to be very important for a historical approach, as opposed to any sort of empirical approach that a natural scientist could take. And then finally, for the organic versus mechanical distinction, he speaks of chronological versus mathematical number. And this actually isn't like a true distinction between numbers. This is probably another area where he's actually got a very good insight here, but the only way he can express it in the framework that German philosophy has crunched his mind into is through chronological versus mathematical number. So as you probably all well know, there's two kinds of numbers generally, cardinal and ordinal. So the cardinal numbers 1, 2, 3, the ordinal numbers first, second, third. So ordinal just gives you a rank, whereas cardinal gives you a quantity. And those are the two ways to split up number. Like, that's the fundamental way. And, like, just because you're German, like, you don't get to do it differently. Sorry. Okay. But what he's trying to get at with this chronological versus mathematical is the same thing he's talking about, as he'll talk about more, with this difference between time versus space. So he's saying that basically they just focus on the mathematics of these isolated processes, these natural thinkers, these mathematical, mechanical thinkers. And he's different because he sees it chronologically. He's thinking about it as this life process unfolding, as this lifespan unfolding. So the path dependency of that lifespan is going to be very important, because once you know that for him, these high cultures, these organisms are at a certain point in their lifespan, then you can actuarially, like an insurance company has all these actuaries to try to estimate as best they can when you, I, or anyone is going to fucking kick the bucket, right? So, anyway, so he's kind of like an actuary of cultures. You could view it in a certain way. He's saying, well, the Western culture is on not borrowed time, but the clock's ticking for it. Only a few more centuries before Western man kind of collapses, he would think. So anyway, on to the fourth point. Here, he speaks of Kant's error in a massive footnote. We've got our first footnote in the book, so I know a lot of you are really excited out there. Yes, we have gotten to the first footnote. Pop the champagne. We're there, baby. So he speaks of Kant's error, first of all, bringing outer and inner man into relation with time and space through pure scheme. And then second, arithmetic versus geometrical instead of chronological versus mathematical. So that's how Kant broke things up. Now, I'm certainly not a Kant expert. Obviously it's important to engage with these German philosophers, but it's just, first of all, who has the time? These guys spill so much ink because they don't want to speak clearly, because if they spoke clearly, the ideas would be more readily subjected to scrutiny. Most German philosophers do not want that. So, you get more dishonest philosophies out of here. It's very difficult to call them anything else. And that's not to say Spengler's a dishonest philosopher. To really any degree, I don't think he is. Maybe with himself to some degree, but I don't think he's ever actually trying to pull the wool over his listeners' eyes or his readers' eyes. Whereas, you get these just rapscallions like Hegel and Marx who, I don't know. I would just say read Eric Vogelin, read his work about Hegel and Marx, and you'll learn quite a bit. Anyway, so my point here with his criticism of Kant's error and this chronological versus mathematical number, he's actually getting at something very important here. And I think this is probably going to be a recurring theme in my commentary on Decline of the West and Spengler's work broadly, is he's getting at something interesting. He gets at very interesting things, and oftentimes incisive, perspicacious, a lot of predictive power, or at least he's accurate in certain predictions in a way that gives confidence in his methodology. But my feeling is he's often right for the wrong reasons, and it's still just an intuition largely. I'm trying to form up, the case there, and I welcome counter arguments, attempts to refute any objections. That's how we gain greater understanding. Not that I'm some sort of dialectician here, but a man needs to be open to criticism. That's certainly the truth. But I think this chronological versus mathematical number, it's not some metaphysical thing. Maybe it is. What it is that it boils down to path dependency. And almost any process in your own life is going to be severely path dependent. I'm not sure if that's the correct adverb. Significantly path dependent, perhaps. So I'll take a very mundane example. So taking a shower and putting on your clothes, that's path dependent. You can't put on your clothes before you take your shower. You gotta shower first and then put on your clothes. Otherwise, you're gonna be all wet in your clothes. It's a very mundane example, but this is a fundamental aspect of all processes. So you've got guys who try to study the stock market and make the big bucks on there. And actually, these are some of the best examples of people who maybe should consider Spengler's dichotomy a little bit more, because they maybe go into the stock market with a little bit too much of this world as nature framework, as Spengler would call it, and not enough world as history. Best example of this, these guys in 1998, long-term capital management, total whiz kids. They had won awards, I believe a guy who had been part of the Black-Scholes-Merton option formula, which actually isn't a good way to price your options, but it's I don't think it's a great way to price your options. Anyway, so these guys, had academic credentials out the wazoo, very celebrated guys. So they tried to implement that in their hedge fund, long-term capital management. It blew up when, events that they didn't predict, that they didn't think were possible of happening within their model, because it was outside of 3 standard deviations or 5 standard deviations or 10 standard deviations, whatever it is. And right, if it were a phenomenon subject to a bell curve distribution, a normal distribution, you can't get a 10 sigma event in such a case. But that shows that you've got the wrong map for the territory. If something that's 10 sigma happens, then your model's completely wrong. So anyway, that's applying this world is nature, not path-dependent view that he really criticizes. It's just the world is space, not the world is time. And we'll get into that more during the last point. So anyway, moving on to the 5th point. So he says spiritual political events are not to be arranged by scheme of cause and effect. So he thinks cause and effect thinking, this is nature thinking. This is world is nature. That's not what we want. Because cause and effect, that doesn't apply to history, in his view. What applies to history is destiny, and we'll get into that more. What does he really mean with destiny? So in this point about spiritual political events that are not to be arranged by schemes of cause and effect, he says a pragmatic and materialistic historians, they don't get it. And they try to figure out what historical events are versus what they signify. So he wants to understand what they signify. And this means what they point to by appearing. So maybe this is what he means by symbolism. What something that happens in the history of a culture points to by appearing. But what is that to say? I mean, is that to say that there's great symbolism when I get my first gray hair? I mean, which has long since happened. I had a couple grays even as a teenager. But, is there great symbolism to that? Because that seems like, in a sense, maybe that's the most minimal definition of symbol that one could give for Spengler. I'm not entirely sure. But I just broached that question. And then he criticizes the pragmatic and materialist historians again, as they have not carefully considered morphological relationships that inwardly bind together the expression forms of all brands of a culture. So this gets back to that whole prime symbol, this religious symbol idea, and that he believes when a culture is healthy in its organic phase of fulfillment, or phase of development before it's fulfilling itself, perfecting itself in this kind of Greek sense as a civilization, as this dead thing become. And it's very important for him that this religious symbol binds all of the expression forms of the culture. And in the next section of the introduction, he's going to get into some very interesting historical analogies, and that's really going to be him at his best, and you should look forward to that. And then the final point, or sub-point for this 5th point, is the things he looks for as key evidence for his comparative morphological approach. These are going to be the key categories of sources of evidence for him. So the fundamental ideas, the early ornamentation, so the early art forms, early ornamentation, the basic forms of architecture and arts, and their dramas, their lyrics, choice and development of great arts, detail of their craftsmanship, choice of materials. So he's going to try to look at all this material evidence that's left to us, primarily in the form of artistic, architectural, and other expressive forms. And he's going to look at that as the key way for him to understand what is the soul of this culture, what's its prime symbol, these questions. Moving on to the 6th point, Spengler touts his project as the first theory-enlightened art of historical treatment. And he says there have only been physics-style treatments, and those are only theory-informed. His is theory-enlightened now. To what extent being informed about something and being enlightened about something are distinguishable by an essential characteristic or any other principal distinction, I believe the jury is out on that, but that's what Oswald thinks. So anyway, he does have a good point here. He criticizes Kant again for taking nature as the only object of reason's activity, for taking these kinds of systematic ways of thinking as the only thing that reason can do, or that it should. And this is kind of that distinction between Vernunft and Verstand. That is so... We'll get into that more because there's a long footnote about that later in the introduction, but I just broached that briefly now. So that brings us on to our final point, logic of space, nature, the thinking that he criticizes as applied to history, versus the logic of time, and that is the logic of history. That's what he wants to inform his comparative morphology. And this is the difference between cause and effect logic and organic necessity or destiny. And again, after reading both volumes and now rereading the first for this series, it's very difficult to define a lot of these terms in any way that I think would be reasonably satisfactory to an English speaker in 2023, as much as I can speak for one. Because... Well, it's just very hard to say what does destiny really mean, and is he playing on any equivocations with it? So he calls it organic necessity here. And if all he's saying is that everything that's born is going to die, and that if we know its lifespan, we can tell generally how far it has left to live, okay. I mean, that's something, but is it that much? I mean, it's a bit of a commonplace. If you say, well, that guy's 60 years old, I can predict, he'll be dead in 40 years. Like, great. Like, what? And he's going to, continue to slouch more and more, and his posture is going to get worse, and all his organ functions are going to get worse. And you're just like, okay, like, what does that actually tell me? So that's why I wonder sometimes, and that's why I wonder more and more, if what's actually driving Spengler to make correct predictions is something he's not talking about. If it is just intuitionistic. Now, and he does tout the intuitionistic throughout with his historical approach. But it seems like there might be something greater and even more intuitionistic that's actually helping him to make his correct predictions when he does make correct predictions, more than the explicit framework that he sets out here. And that's just a question that's nothing I have any answer to, just an intuition of mine, and something I hope to look into more and more. So the next thing he says, his view is informed by myth, religion, and art. And that's exactly what it is. I mean, the mythological, the religious, the artistic, this for him, these really are the true sources of evidence for history, because these are going to show the soul of the culture. And they're, based on their forms, you're going to be able to know what the prime symbol is. And for him, everything that happens to the culture during its lifespan is going to be what would express that sort of prime symbol at that time in the lifespan of the culture. And so maybe there is an analogy to a person there. Somebody has an impetuous personality, that wouldn't. Yeah, I'm not sure how that analogy would work, but certainly, the ideals that someone would hold through their life would have an effect on them differently at every different point in their life. So there's certainly truth to it, but something I'm concerned with is how much of it is just commonplace, how much of it is just a general truth, and how much of it can actually inform our approach, our methodology rigorously. How much of it, Yeah, just how much can it really function as a basis for this methodology and help the analytical framework? Because to the extent it doesn't help your analytical framework, it hurts it. Because you want parsimony, you want to make fewer conjectures and fewer assumptions in order to explain whatever it is that you seek to explain. That's Science 101. So, anyway, the next thing he says is, nature is written in math, right? And this probably goes back to Pythagoras, and I believe it's certainly true. I mean, the fact that, Isaac Newton, obviously his theory of gravity has been superseded by general relativity, and then you've got ideas of quantum gravity. But, as a practical matter, Newtonian mechanics explain the world at our level very, very well. And, the fact that he can express this all mathematically, these relationships, and you just put a constant in there, and that shows this natural relationship. It's extraordinary. And so nature is written in math, he says, but history, nobody set out to figure out the language that it's written in until Oswald Spengler. And for him, he's trying to figure out what history's written in. Now, I think he's already, figured it out in his mind as he's written this, and he's just setting it up rhetorically because he believes history is written in symbols. What does Julius Caesar represent as a symbol when he appears? Things like that. So yeah. And finally, he talks about naturalistic chronology versus historical ordering of the the phenomenological world. So, yeah, I guess I just kind of highlighted that as like a Spenglerism of what is this guy really actually even saying here? Sometimes it's difficult to feel very confident about really understanding sometimes whether it's all just fluff or whether this actually adds anything to your analytical firepower that is sufficient to defray the cost that adding another assumption or another concept to your analytical framework necessarily has on your framework, on your parsimony. So, finally, his final point of the chapter, which I've just put as a sub-point here, is that he thinks together nature and history cover the whole world. And by that, I think he means this is a comprehensive binary. His binary between history and nature that covers every phenomena you could ever see around the entire world. And they're also mutually exclusive. Something's historical or something's natural, in his view. So you've got a comprehensive dichotomy that never overlaps, and this explains everything in the world. Now, if somebody presents a concept like that with enough caveats, or with reasonable caveats, I think you can go for it because you always need simplifying assumptions to conduct any analysis in the most efficient way. All these ideas that because you make a general statement and there might be exceptions to it, that defeats your argument. Those are very poor arguments against your argument. But the fact that he's created a comprehensive binary here and he wants to split the world completely between these two categories, it raises some suspicion in my mind of just how sound his analytical framework is. So with that, I conclude my summary and commentary on part 3 of the introduction of Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, the most interesting work of historiography ever written. Thanks very much for your time and attention. Peace out. Have a great day.